Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Well, it's 2024 and I've now owned the Canon R7 for about 6 months. So I bought it late June, early July, so just under 6 months. But in that time I've used the camera very extensively. For a period of time there, it was the camera I was shooting on exclusively, even though I still own the EOS R. And I just want to give more of a sort of a long-term review. You can check my channel. I did do an initial impressions review, and I also did sort of a more in-depth review of my experience with the camera after I had owned it for a month or so. But I just want to give my impressions after owning the camera for like 6 months. I think it's important to look at reviews like this because there's some things that you don't learn about the camera until you've had the chance to use it for a while, quirks and issues and stuff that pop up. Okay, so first I just want to talk about the autofocus. Now when I first got this camera I was blown away by the autofocus. Now I'm a portrait people photographer primarily. I'm not a wildlife photographer, so maybe this seemed like a weird camera to buy, considering that I know that this is a very popular camera for wildlife shooters because of the extra reach of the crop factor, but I was actually looking at using it for portraiture. I thought it would be interesting with the high megapixel sensor to see how that would work with shooting like super detailed portraits and stuff. Now when I first got the camera, like I said, I was blown away with the autofocus, and I took it on a shoot and I just, yeah, like every shot was just sharp and it was effortless, and the autofocus system seemed to work flawlessly. Now fast forwarding a bit further down the line, I have noticed that there are autofocus issues. Now these have been talked about extensively in the wildlife shooting community, and the camera does have an issue where it seems to float a little bit, so you'll be locked onto a subject, and if you're shooting a burst you'll notice that it might be soft and then sharp, soft, and it's just, and I'm talking about really small adjustments here where you'll look at a photo and it'll be just slightly like it just slightly missed the having a tack sharp image. But it is there and it is real. Now I will say that I've done a couple of firmware upgrades. I think I'm on 1.4.0 at the moment, and I did find that that upgrade improved the autofocus for me personally, shooting with third-party lenses, Sigma lenses. I don't know if that's related. There was nothing in the notes talking about that, but I did notice that not just my autofocus but also the metering and things like that in the R7 improved with that update. So if you have this camera and you haven't updated to 1.4.0 or whatever the current firmware is that is the current firmware for the R7 right now, I would recommend that you do that. I have noticed that as I've upgraded the firmware, the camera has function better. Okay, so it's good to see that Canon is still supporting the camera and still trying to make it better. They didn't make much of a fuss about the last firmware update, but I think it's definitely worth doing. I've noticed an improvement in performance since upgrading, so that's something to consider. Now in terms of everything else about the camera, it's just, yeah, it's perfect for me. Like I love it. I will say that I have almost turned this camera into my video camera. Like this is the camera that I shoot all my video on pretty much. I've used it on an engagement shoot. That video is on my channel. I think it's got thousands of views at this point. But I've primarily been using the R7 for video, which surprises me because I'm not really a video shooter, but I love this camera for video. A lot of those autofocus issues that I mentioned just don't really seem to exist in video. I don't know what that is. I'm not sure whether that's because the sensor doesn't need to read as quickly, or whether it's got to do something with the shutter. I have no idea. but I will say that for video, I found this camera to be 100% rock solid, and yeah, the quality is fantastic out of it. You get 60p 4K without an additional crop, or you have like a cropped in mode, which is good if you're like shooting wildlife or something, or you just need to get more reach out of a lens that you have. There are issues with doing that where the footage doesn't look exactly the same. It can be a little bit more noisy, but it is an option that you have there. And of course the 24p or 30p image, which is oversampled from 8K, just looks amazing. Like, it's one of the sharpest images, video images I've ever seen. And I think you'd have to go to something like the R5 to find a video image that's going to be comparable to that. So I think this is a great camera. Now, I wouldn't really recommend this camera for people that want this as a primary portrait camera anymore. I've taken some amazing shots with this camera, and I'll put some up there, some portrait shots, and in a weird way some of my favorite shots have been with this camera. But I just find the files a little bit more demanding to work with. Now, that might be because they're high megapixel files, but I find color grading them is a little bit trickier. I don't think they're quite as flexible when you're color grading the files, and that's obviously it's a crop sensor body. It doesn't have as much dynamic range or color depth, but I wouldn't recommend this as a portrait photography camera if that's all you're doing. Okay, now what I would recommend this for is if you're shooting wildlife. Now, I did do just a tiny bit of wildlife shooting. I don't have any really long lenses, but for the little bit that I did, it was great. And so I think that this is a great option if you are shooting wildlife. Now, the other thing that surprisingly I love this camera for is landscape photography. I've shot quite a bit over the holidays, using both the Sigma 18-35 1.8 and also the older Canon EF 16-35mm f4, and I love that pairing of the 16-35mm f4 with this camera. I'm getting some lovely colors. I'll put some images up on the screen, and I love the detail that you get. It is kind of mind-blowing, the detail you get with this 32.5 megapixel crop sensor. Now, the only issue with that is, of course, the field of view, and not having personally not having a lens that's wider than 16 millimeters. I don't think wider than 16 millimeters, and that's going to restrict you if you want those really wide shots, unless you're using the panoramic mode, which of course is an option in the R7. So surprisingly, yeah, I kind of love this camera for landscape. So would I recommend this camera? I think, again, it really depends on what you're using it for. I've decided to keep the camera. I was considering selling it and maybe buying a second full frame camera, but I find that this camera really complements my full frame camera. I love the video out of it. I love that it doesn't overheat. I love that it has 60p that doesn't overheat. I like that it shoots in cinema gamut, C-Log 3, it's got zebras, all that cool stuff. I like that I have the option of a higher megapixel sensor if I'm doing something that requires that. But this for me is more of a backup secondary camera. I think if you're shooting wildlife or macro, that would be different. But for me, I'm using this as my backup camera, also as my video camera, and also just as a bit of a fun camera if I want to go out and shoot some landscape. So it's not all rosy with the R7, to be honest, and I'm not sure what is what causes the autofocus issues with this camera, but it is not as consistent as something like the R6, R5, R6 Mark II, and obviously the R3. It's just a little bit inconsistent, and that makes it very hard to rely on this camera for photography, shooting it professionally, because if I'm on a shoot, I don't want to ever be second guessing whether I'm nailing focus. If it's showing me that it's on an eye, I want to know that it's locked on 100%. And like I said, that is not an issue in video with this camera. I'm not sure what's going on there. Maybe this will all be resolved with a firmware update. But for me, I'm keeping the camera. I think it's a great backup camera. I think it's, for the money, for what you pay for it, I think it's got great features. I think if you're shooting any video, this is an amazing choice. This is just such a great video camera. If you want more information about shooting video on this, I'd highly recommend that you go and look at Josh Satton's YouTube channel. He has a lot of testing and informative videos on the R7 and using the R7. He's also got comparison videos between the R7 and other Canon cameras, and you might be shocked at how well the R7 compares and even beats some of the higher spec Canon cameras when it comes to video and shooting in C-Log 3. So for me, it's a mixed bag. I'm keeping the camera. I would recommend the camera, but only for certain use cases. But I think it's a great value for money proposition for a lot of people. And yeah, so for me, it's a thumbs up. I don't know. It's a strange situation where I think Canon was so close to hitting an absolute home run with this, but I think some of the autofocus issues in stills mode maybe can still be resolved. I'm not sure, but hopefully that's fixed in a future firmware update. But for now, I'm using it as a backup and I'm using it for video. So I hope that review hasn't bummed you out. I still love the camera. I still use the camera all the time, and it's a great camera. But yeah, just be aware that if you're buying it, there are some issues there. They've been well documented on other channels, and but yeah, it's still a great camera. Okay, that's it from me today, guys, and see you on the next one. Bye.